Hi there, and a very warm welcome to this week's video in which we are tackling an old topic, which is diffraction grating. So this comes from our CD shader days. And the reason we are going to look at it again is EverDrone, a developer who developed a new technique inside of Octane to do this. And I got inspired by it, and on top of that developed my own technique. So this is a very nerdy and chart time driven one. So I really recommend some coffee. So let's get some coffee and jump right in. Before we jump into 3D and do our shading there, let me explain to you what we are actually doing by explaining diffraction grating. If you already know from, for example, the compact disc video, then you can of course jump ahead and go straight into 3D. For those uninitiated, diffraction grating, very similar to a prism, takes the light and splits it to its color components. So essentially, white light will become a rainbow. But other than a prism that refracts its light to its wavelength components, diffraction grating is an interference pattern from the wave attribute of the light. As you can see from this cool graphic, light can behave as a wave. This is from a two-slit experiment, so you can see two slits where the waves are coming through and therefore form an interference pattern. So the light waves either add up and form a very bright spot, or they cancel each other out and form a dark spot. But usually light, other than a laser, is consistent of multiple wavelengths, especially white light. This is because in white light all colors are equally distributed. And since the definition of a color is a certain wavelength, it has its own interference pattern. So in other words, red light has a slightly different interference pattern than green light. So again, in other words, when the colors of the light hit something and create waves, they will all add up and cancel out at slightly different positions, and therefore we get the known rainbow effect. Of course, as the waves forming around the two slits are symmetrical, also the diffraction pattern is symmetrical on both sides. Since there's of course more interference than just the one we depicted, there's also more diffraction grating happening, and this is visible in the second order spectrum. There will be even third order spectrum, but they get less and less visible, so in our tutorial we just concentrate on the first order. No, I'm not talking about Star Wars. And last but not least, two slits let very little light through, and it's also not very common in nature. So what we usually have is just an array of slits, such as with the pattern that you see in a CD through its grooves, and therefore you end up with the CD again with its diffraction grating pattern and colors. And welcome back to EverDrone's developer blog. I want to shout him out because with his technique he brought everything in motion, and this is what we are tackling next. So on 1st November he released this written guide in which he goes very well into detail about how to achieve that. This is also linked in the description below. And now, finally, welcome to Cinema 4D Land. I opted for the shading layout because we are doing quite a bit with materials today. As you can see, I'm using quite a Silverwing-ish scene with just a base pattern on the floor, and then we have a very squished cube and a light source. This cube is actually a stand-in for a material ball as we want to act on very simple surfaces first. Speaking of materials, let's add a metal material to the scene and then add it to the cube. Here we go. Side note, if you're following this channel for a bit and have keen eyes, you probably have noticed that we are using the bathroom HDRI again. Now, for the EverDrone technique to work, we need an extra geometry that envelops our cube, and the easiest way to get there is to duplicate our cube and just make it a little bit bigger. So I'm going with plus 0.01 on all of those sides. Let's copy this value and paste it to the other channels as well. Easy as that. Now, of course, it wouldn't be any good if the material on the second cube would stay a metal because we want to see what's underneath. So what we actually need to do is create a glass material, or in Octane terms, a specular material. Let's assign the specular material to the bigger cube so we can see the smaller one inside. To avoid any rendering overhead later on, let's go to the comment tab of the specular material and tick fake shadows. So basically what we've done for now is a physical clear coat layer on top of our metal. I can show this to you by going to the metal and cranking up the roughness of it. And then you can see we have a rough metal reflection and on top of it a glossy clear coat one. This is, however, just for understanding purposes. EverDrone's material needs to be fully glossy like this. We of course going to use the specular material somehow to create the diffraction grating colors out of it. And the best way to do this is via the dispersion. So what we need to do is go instead of API number with the Cauchy formula and then max it out at 1. Also, as pointed out before, we have two reflections on top of each other right now, one of the metal and one of the glass. We only need one, so let's go to the reflection and turn it down to 0 here. And I hear you say, hey, we don't see any diffraction grating yet, and this is correct because we need to do something to our metal. The cool stuff only happens if we have some normal activity. Not paranormal, just normal. EverDrone figured out if we now tilt the normal, then some magic happens. To do this, what we can do is get an RGB spectrum and get it into tangent normal space 0.5, 0.51, plug it into the normal, so nothing should happen here. This is, of course, unless I tinker around with the values and therefore change the angle of the normal. So let's do this and figure out what happens. And yes, we can see now the reflection is split up like our diffraction grating. This right now only mimics one side of the standing wave that also happens on the other side, remember from the beginning. So if we move this value past 0.5, we also can move it to the other side like this. But then of course we have moved it and it's not on the other side anymore, so we can have one or the other right now. Of course, EverDrone thought of that, so on his website he provides a MicroGrating OSL script. If we copy that and then bring it over to our scene, let's search for OSL, then go with the add OSL and paste the script in there. And if we connect the OSL to our material, in this case the normal, then the associated ports show up. But what we get is a very unsatisfying black material, and this is because Octane populates all the fields with a 0. Of course, the right values are on EverDrone's blog post, but if you wait, you can see me fill them in here. To get our reflection back, some of those fields need a value other than 0, for example density. I fill in a whopping 50, then the next one is amplitude 0.01, also the height map amplitude 1, and last but not least EPS, which is sort of a ray epsilon for this script here, 0.0001 or something like that. And here we go, we finally see something again. What this gives us is a normal map that mimics a triangle wave, so it alternates between looking to one side and then to the other. Now the density is supposed to be the density of those ridges, so we should be seeing 50 here, but this is not the case. This took me a while to get, but we need to add in a projection here to actually get to the right count. Here we go. Last but not least, right now this acts left to right, but to continue with our pattern we want to go front back. So what we need to do is go to the OSL script and turn the rotation by 90 degrees. You can see we get the diffraction grating from the back side, but the front side is actually there, it's just a matter of changing the camera angle, like this. This is also the right point to jump inside of our camera, which looks straight down so we can see the diffraction grating a little bit better. Let's polish this a little bit. So the first thing that you can see is the triangle wave. That is very irritating because it's very coarse. So what we can do is raise the density to a sub-pixel level. We just need to find a high enough number. For me, it's just adding a 0 to 500. Here we go. Of course, you would need to set this dependent on the distance of your camera, because if you go closer, then you will see the grating here again. Though this can also add to your scene, as diffraction grating is created through microscopic ridges. Also, if you're not keen on those strong oversaturated colors, what you can do is go to your render settings, imager, and then engage with the ACES tone mapping that makes it better, or any other tone mapper that you use. And one last noteworthy thing when it comes to quality, sometimes you get this colored noise in between both sides of the spectrum, and you can get rid of it with the EPS value. Because the EPS value basically rounds your triangle wave, so if we take away a 0, you can see not even all the colors are showing up. And if we add 2 zeros, so one more than before, you can see the colored noise is almost eradicated. Now let's switch back to our camera. I zoomed in a little bit secretly so we are a little bit closer and see what's going on better. Now, we will move from EverDrones material to my edition soon, but first let's have some fun with the inputs here. If you want to do something along the lines of a compact disk shader, I wonder where this idea came from, we need to create a gradient generator. I did this before. Let's also plug that into the specular so we can see what this is doing. First, let's set the gamma to 1, so this ensures the linearity of the scene and undistorted operation later on. Then go to the gradient type and set it to angular. So around the center of your UV space, this will create a gradient from black to completely white. Let's actually replug the noodle in the rotation map of the OSL texture like this, and we can see nothing is happening. This is because if we go to the OSL and look at our rotation map amount, it is 0. So what we can do is set it to 360. Now something is happening, but it's not looking too good. This is because we set the rotation here to 90 before. So if we now set this to 0, then we have the black hole from Interstellar. This actually is the expected behavior. It just looks funny because our light is elongated and we have a very long focal length. So if we exchange the light source for a sphere and then move the camera slightly off axis, you can see here's our diffraction grating. If we move out of our camera and move the scene camera around, you can see this is indeed looking very compact disk-like. Of course, if you want to go more for an holographic effect, like in one of the scenes of the intro, what we can do is go for fan and then create a fan spiral and then just plug in this one here instead. So you can go really wild with what you do and you can see what comes out of it. And now that we have a rough overview over what can be done, let's actually talk about the disadvantages in another scene. And welcome to our material ball scene. So what we have here is copied over both of the materials, the metal as well as the glass, but we only could apply the metal because for the glass we need an extra layer. And this is one of the disadvantages. You probably will agree with me that this is a little bit more complicated than a cube that you just can enlarge. There are possibilities though. For example, what you can do is duplicate the object, then use a displace modifier to enlarge the hull. For this we need to give it a white material, so color, and it's white per default. Now this is inflated quite a lot, so we need to lower it down, so 0.01 for example. Then actually make sure the topmost object is the one with the mesh inside. And last but not least, cross your fingers and add the material. Here we go, and we have Diffraction Grating. You can see it's working, but it's a rather clean SDS model, so if you use CAD data for example, then good luck. Before I go over the last two disadvantages that come from the glass material directly, let's up the quality a little bit. Those artifacts you're seeing here are unfortunately only mitigated by a higher mesh resolution. This, more unfortunately, also goes for my shader. The source of the artifact is the object where the grating material is applied to. So what we need to do is go to our material ball, the initial one, and raise the subdivisions to, for example, 4x4. Now, this already looks better, but you can still see some remaining artifacts, and this is because now we have a mismatch between the coating layer and the actual ball. So we also need to raise the coating layer to the same amount. Here we go. Now, in an ideal world, you wouldn't have to raise these subdivisions at all, but in this scenario you have to raise it for the base object as well as the coating, which is double bad. Though to give compliments where it's due, I think it looks very pristine. Now on to the promised glass disadvantages, but before we do, let's switch the tone mapping. You might be wondering what tone mapping we are using, and you might be surprised that we are already using aces because this is oversaturated, but if we turn it off, it looks even more horrible. So I used compositing nodes to give it a HEX treatment, and this is the look out of that. Okay, one more last tweak before I actually show you the disadvantages, and this is setting the rotation here back to 0, because I want the diffraction grating on the top and the bottom of the actual light reflection here. If you are a grader, you might be already seeing what's wrong here. Well, I brought this over from Birders, but I don't think it exists, so I probably brought this to life right now. But back to topic, let's talk about the first error here, and it's really easy to spot. Basically the gradient here is inverted or the wrong way around. The way I can tell is that you always have the direct reflection of the light in the middle, and then to both sides of the light you have the grating effect. And the red spectrum is usually the furthest away from the light. And with our glass method, the purplish blue spectrum actually is. And the other thing, to no surprise, the glass material is made for the spectral behavior of glass and not for diffraction grating. So while the gradient of a diffraction grating is actually linear, the one of a glass has an emphasis towards the red spectrum. What I'm talking about is that all colors should be equally distributed along the gradient, but the red is the shortest and the purple one is the longest. If you do holographic foil shaders, I think no one will ever notice. Heck, I think even if you do a CD shader, no one will ever notice, and this goes for the inverted gradient too. If you want to be a little bit more physically accurate though, then it's worth looking at the approach I took, which is next. And if you are a gradie like I am and develop this shader further, for example, to not get artifacts in the sections we did, then please share it with me in the community, as I think such niche projects can really profit from it. But now on to my approach. Welcome to our comparison scene. Now, spoiler ahead, my material not only has advantages, it also has disadvantages. But we will see later, of course. Right now, what I have here, or what you're looking at, is 2 times the grating material from EverDrone, and we are going to replace one of them with my approach. By the way, if you're still thinking about the previous chapter, here you can see the uneven distribution of the gradient really well. So my first thought to mitigate something was actually to avoid the MicroGrating to see it on camera. So if we go really close, no matter what size it has, it will become visible at some point. So I thought there must be a better way for a shader to be variable, and I came up with a nice solution. My thought was, can we break up those lines a little bit better so we don't see them? In essence, make the pattern irregular. To randomize a pattern so it's invisible to the camera no matter the distance to the object, we need to give each sample a random value, so every ray that is shot through the scene. To explain my thoughts a little bit better, let's bring out the Cinema 4D noise, set it to cell noise and add it to the specular as before. I know this is just another pattern and on top of it it's very coarse, but I ask you to think of every one of those patches as a random sample. So my thinking was, if we somehow create a shader that can hold a random value per sample, then we can also create a shader that can orient the normal based on that random value. And let me remind you that the OSL grating just exists to make the gradient appear on both sides of the light. Now, let me make a very crude version of how this works. Remember in the beginning when we used an RGB spectrum to shift the colors, so we got the tangent normal colors 0.5, 0.51. Let me plug that into the normal and shift the first R value to 0.625, and you can see now we have the shift that we actually need, but just on one side. Let me duplicate the RGB spectrum here and then shift it to the other side. So what I want to do is go minus 0.25. Here we go. Now we have the same thing, but on the other side. Now, if the sample random value is truly linear, meaning that 50% of the samples are below 0.5 and 50 are above, then what we can do is use a math unary, pipe it through the algorithm here, and then set it to round. Then what this lets us do is drive a switch. We are going to use a mix here in which we are accumulating both of those angles, then plug that into the normal, then use our values to distinguish between them. Let's unplug the specular because it's voiding the view on one half of our samples, and we can see, yes, this is actually working. Of course, ironically, this gives us yet another pattern which we wanted to avoid, but let's have a proof of concept here by going to the transform and transform it really small, 0.001. You can still see it, but you can see that it mimics the other formula quite well. What you already can see though is that the in-between part here is much more clean. This is because we have an either or with no interpolation. I initially had planned to write this OSL script right here, but this tutorial already runs a little bit long, so I'm opting for just showing what I did. And if you're interested in writing OSL scripts with me, we can do that in another tutorial. So instead of our Cinema 4D noise that was for explanation purposes so you can see what's going on, I have this random sampler here. So what it is doing is sampling the shading point position and gives each sample a random value. This is basically by running the shading point through a hash function, and if you're not satisfied with the shading point, you can also feed it with UVs. But especially since the effect is taking place in shading position space, you can get really close without ever seeing samples. Of course, the effect itself needs a little bit to render. And welcome to the great finale, where we make things right, because remember, we are still using the glass material with its nonlinear inverted gradient. So right now, we are only using our random samples with all the random values to split the shader 50-50. So another idea struck. What if we take those random sample values and do two things with it? One, adjust the strength of the normal tilt, and second, color them. What this achieves is an assigned color by the angle of the normal. So long story short, we don't need our glass material anymore to get the coloring. For this we need to exchange as well as get some new nodes in our shader, so let's get rid of some of the old ones that we don't need any longer. First off, I put all the normal switching inside of another OSL node. It expects a random value in the strength, but this usually is a little bit strong, as you can see here. So I opt for a range map here. The range mapping could be scripted into the OSL node itself. It depends a little bit on your feedback if we do that or not. To get this to work, we need to redefine the output minimum and maximum. I already know the values 0.275 and 0.4. So minimum defines the starting angle and maximum the reach. Let's move on to synthesize the color out of there, which has the greatest caveat of this method. To do so spectrally, because Octane is a spectral renderer and we are not satisfied with RGB values, we actually need a Gaussian spectrum. So this Gaussian spectrum actually has a wavelength we can put in. And this is where the random sampler comes in handy a second time. So let's feed it with this and then go to the specular. This is already working kind of, sort of, but we need to understand the Gaussian spectrum better to make the adjustments we need. So follow me to a very late surprise chart time. And welcome to a Cinema 4D chart time. Let's hit the important points first. So spectral means that we are not only relying on RGB data, but on the whole spectrum. This means in Octane we not only can define R, G and B, but colors in between as well. And the Gaussian spectrum is a tool that lets you choose other colors than RGB. Let's go over its attributes. First of all, let's connect the name. The Gaussian is coming from the distribution pattern of the selection, which is a Gaussian curve. So what's within the Gaussian curve will be selected and output as a color, or in professional speak, spectral data. First of all, the wavelength is very self-explanatory, so values from 0 to 1 move the Gaussian through the visible spectrum, so from blue to red. With the help of this chart time, the next one should be also very easy to understand, which is the width, and this controls the width of the spectrum here. So if it's very narrow, we are sampling very narrow bands, and therefore the color is very saturated. If we increase the width, more and more colors are sampled, and therefore we get more and more to a white output that will include all the colors. And last but not least, also very easy to understand, is the power, which defines the height of our Gaussian spectrum, or in other words, we are getting a lower or a higher brightness output. And this is already all, so this is chart time over. And welcome back to Cinema 4D Land. Let's choose the right values for our Gaussian spectrum. First of all, the wavelength here is driven by the random sampler. This means color values all over the spectrum are chosen and then fit to the orientation of the normal to give us the gradient here. If we are looking at the width, this is very high, so we are sampling over a lot of different colors with one sample, and this is not what we want. So instead, we want a small value, and I already know that one, 0.0375. And this gives us a very saturated gradient. If you look at this, you can see its biggest caveat, especially if you compare it to the EverDrone version, this has gotten quite dark. This has something to do with Octane's restriction to put only values inside of the material that are really physically accurate. So values above 1 are not allowed. But in this case we are actually losing energy because we are sampling over the spectrum here and basically get out one single color per sample. So one sample that basically has the power to hold the whole spectrum is now reduced to one single color. And this of course shows in the energy loss here in the output. And welcome back to our material ball scene where we finalize our material. So let's apply it to the ball and let's see how it looks. And it's sort of horrid. One of the things to do is to fix those horrid projection seams here. And this is very easy. So what we can do is go to projection and just plug it into the UVs. This will make sure that the actual UVs of the mesh will be taken into account. This looks better, but we are still getting artifacts. As mentioned before, those are only mitigated by increasing the mesh resolution. So let's do this by going to the mesh and then therefore the subdivisions and set them to 4x4 again. Also this time for the bottom piece as well. Looking much better. Now when it comes to the darkness, there's a little bit of good news because we can fix it a little bit by going with a color correction. Because we can boost the signal at least to be full white. So in the brightness here we can set it to 5 and therefore get a little bit more brightness out of there. And last but not least, this is an artistic one, we can extend the range of our diffraction grating. And of course, with our setup, we have full control here. So what we can do, for example, is 0.15 to 0.7 and therefore get a really colorful display. This now really looks like some holographic wrapping foil. And this is where I'm going to leave it for today. As you can see on screen, there are a lot more possibilities with diffraction grating. If you're interested in more tutorials around this topic, for example recreating one of those objects, then leave a comment down below. If you're interested in the OSL scripts that I use, those can be downloaded also in the description down below of my Google Drive. No strings attached. But if you want to support me, then there is Patreon. I would be happy if you at least give that a consideration. Speaking of Patreon, let's end this video by thanking exactly those Patreons who made this video possible. Especially my €50 tier subscribers Giles Augustinen and Leon Studio TV. Also, of course, a huge thank you for my €15 tier subscribers for D Thieves, Alessio De Vecchi, Ami Schiedried, Christian Grajewski, Graham Bucknell, Grigoris Morikis, Ivan Tanasiewicz, Joel Mackimer, John Edward, Chris Clemson, Lucas M. Silveira, Mike Rogers, Mikkel Obenhuis, Ness Graphics, Nico Straub, Part 1 of 2, Ralf, Random Capybara, Raiko, Shiro 2049, Zoo Shag, Terry Wayne Ranson, Jan Verbeeke, Yasin Rupp, and Yuri Starikov. Hi there and welcome to the Graties Gathering event. This is my word of the day. I already love it. New Wikipedia entry, Graties, people who are in love with diffraction grating. It's already really late again and I spent way too long on this tutorial. Hopefully you noticed. So I'm making it short and say if you want to help me fight against the algorithm overlords, then post a rainbow in the comments down below. I think I always use that when I have a topic where color is separated. Anyway, I wish you a great early week and if you're watching this later, a fantastic time. And I say happy creating and creating. Bye.